Welcome guests, participants, colleagues, and friends. It's my pleasure to welcome you today at the Maison de la Paix. This is an event organized by Executive Education of the Geneva Graduate Institute. My name is Jérôme Duberry. I'm the academic advisor for our Executive Education program on diplomacy, negotiation, and policy. Today, we have quite a unique panel. First, we talked with Ruth and Jonathan, and we thought, there could be quite an interesting dialogue across time, across geographies, with our third speaker, Yannick. Today, we begin our journey in the 1960s, 1970s, with an immersion in the post-colonial training of African diplomats, conducted by external global North providers, such as the Graduate Institute. And these trainings were an important site for the reenactment and embodiment of Western liberal norms in diplomatic practice. This historical backdrop sets the stage for understanding the transformative journey of diplomacy, but also raises questions of power. Then we change time, we change geopolitical context, we bring in new issues, new actors. The rise of the Silicon Valley and its tech giants symbolizes a new era where digital dominance equals geopolitical influence, highlighted by the creation of tech and cyber ambassador-at-large positions in many countries. In the current era, diplomacy and warfare have seamlessly merged with the digital world. These two perspectives will allow us to examine the following two questions. How has the role of the diplomat evolved to adapt to new geopolitical and technological context? Technology is not new. It's been there since the early beginnings of international relations. And how do hegemonic powers continue to influence diplomatic practice through training and digital tools? Before introducing our distinguished speakers, allow me to announce the launch of our new two-day course on the topic Artificial Intelligence, a Strategic Asset for Diplomacy and Organizations. This course will take place on December 7 and 8, and it will provide participants with a deep understanding of AI, how AI works, and its role in enhancing various professional activities within diplomacy and international organizations. And we have the pleasure to have Yannick as one of the speakers for this course. Now, let me present to you the three speakers. First, to your left. Ruth Craggs is Reader in Political and Historical Geography at King's College London. Her research focuses on decolonization and post-colonial geopolitics, with an emphasis on Britain, Africa, and the Commonwealth. She is principal investigator on the project Training Diplomats at Post-Colonial African States. Then, next to Ruth, Dr. Jonathan Harris is a political geographer whose work focuses on the everyday social dynamics of international politics by examining the geopolitical assemblage of diplomatic, diasporic, and educational settings. He joined King's College London in 2021 as a postdoctoral research fellow in post-colonial diplomacy, following positions at Stranmillis University College and Cambridge University. And last but not least, Yannick Heiniger is a dynamic bridge builder who has tirelessly connected diverse networks, skills, and resources for impactful collaborations. Formerly the Senior Technology Diplomacy Advisor at the Swiss Consulate in San Francisco and Deputy CEO of Swissnex, he played a pivotal role in forging connections in cybersecurity, digital trust, and the humanitarian impact of digital technology. Prior to his tenure in San Francisco, Yannick spent 7 transformative years driving innovation, digital transformation, and partnerships at the International Committee of the Red Cross. Yannick is also a key player in San Francisco-based Technology Diplomacy Network and co-edited the 2nd edition of Diplo's report on the practice of technology diplomacy in the Bay Area. Each speaker will have about 5 to 10 minutes to present their own insights and perspectives. Following these presentations, we will often open the floor to discussions. Ruth and Jonathan, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that very kind introduction. And thank you everyone for braving the rain to come today. I'm just going to tell you a little bit about the project that Jonathan and I are working on, just so you have a sense of where we're coming from when we have the more general discussion. And I promise I will keep it brief. So diplomatic training is now a global phenomenon. We can see that in this building, in the history of this institution. But it's not very much studied as a kind of subject, particularly not its history. And what we're trying to do, in a way, in our project is to say we need to think about diplomatic training as an important site for understanding broader international relations. So diplomatic training is not just something technical, but is something geopolitical. It has a central role in the coherence of the profession of diplomacy, so in bringing together, professionalizing, socializing diplomats. It has a key role as well in producing and reproducing lots of hegemonic visions for what international society could and should look like. And we argue in our work, and it's not something revelatory really, that the funding priorities of many of those funding the diplomatic training, which has changed over time, often shape what is the content of the training courses themselves, who's on them, and how they're taught. But we also argue that diplomatic training sites and spaces are really interesting spaces where those hegemonic world visions can be explored, can be contested, can be altered, can be revised. We know from our experiences in classrooms that it's not a one-way thing. As teachers, we know that our students don't necessarily just reproduce what we tell them, but also that we learn through those processes. So we're very much interested, I think, in the process of training as something which could be a collaborative, productive, as well as kind of contested endeavor. So our work is driven by a few themes. One is about networks of diplomatic training. So it's about who is implicated in diplomatic training, who is doing the training, who are the trainers, and who are the trainees. What does being part of an alumni of a particular institution do? And we were just, this sounds like a terrible name drop, but we were just chatting to the Cameroonian ambassador in Geneva just before this, and he was saying that he went to Eric in Cameroon as his, where he did his training, and lots of the African ambassadors that he meets in Geneva also have that training, and they have that in common. So we're really interested in the impact of those networks. And we were also talking just before about the huge alumni network that the Graduate Institute has. What's the power of those kind of networks and connections? We're also interested in the sites and spaces. We're geographers. So of course we're interested in sites and spaces, but where does training take place and does that matter? Some of the big questions more historically are about whether all the training should be in Europe or whether it should be decentralized, and what those debates might tell us. And then we're interested in the pedagogies as well. So how does training take place? Is it about sitting in lecture theatres? Is it about field courses? Is it about simulations rather? So how are people trained, and what influence does that have? And so our research is very much historical, but we're really interested in exploring those connections between past and present. And that's why we're so excited, I think, to be part of this wider panel, to think about what you might learn from the past, but also what we might learn in making those comparisons about what it means to be a diplomat in different time periods, what's seen as important for diplomats. So just a couple of minutes about our specific project, our more historical context. Our project focuses on the training for African diplomats around the time of decolonization and after. So we're thinking about the 1960s, 70s, 80s, really. And at this time, decolonization meant there were a huge number of African diplomats that needed to be trained. Colonial powers had not trained lots of international diplomats for kind of obvious reasons. And most of those then traveled to external training providers. There wasn't the capacity there wasn't seen to be the capacity in those countries to do the training themselves. So many of them ended up at the Graduate Institute and training programs put on by UNITAR in Paris, in Oxford, in London, for example. Later, there was some relocation onto the African continent in Yaoundé and in Nairobi. So we're very much interested in these training networks, in these sites of spaces. Methodologically, we've been in the archives. We can recommend the archives of the Graduate Institute for anyone who's interested historically. They've given us fantastic levels of detail about kind of the students. And one of the things we're doing straight after this session is we're having another session just next door, which anyone who's interested is welcome to come to, where we'll be launching a visualization which is a kind of interactive map and database that shows where all these different diplomats in training were training, their connections and those kinds of things. And that event will have a particular focus on the Graduate Institute and UNITAR. So if you're interested, do come along. But that's really what our project's trying to do, is to think about the geopolitics and the state building of diplomatic training as its role as a wider part of a kind of technical assistance. And yeah, we're really excited for this conversation about what a diplomat is and needs, what skills they need, past and present. Thank you.
Yannick, do you want to?
Great, so it's my turn to try to reflect about the relevance and the type of profile that a diplomat needs as part of this shifting environment in which we operate. I just returned from 3 years in the Bay Area, where I have witnessed, from the front lines, in a sense, the evolution of what it takes to engage in a shifting environment as you engage with not only global technology firms, but also startups and so on. And what I would like to do in the next 5 to 7 minutes is really to bring it down to 3 things I think a diplomat needs: skill set, a different mindset, and engaging with networks. And if you look at it, it's impossible to look at the mindset, the skill sets, and the networks without first understanding the environment in which technology diplomacy is being done in the Bay Area. And I would like to build on the report that you briefly mentioned that I contributed to about the shifting environment in the Bay Area. We've seen a lot of things changing over the past 5 years in the Bay Area. The first level of observation is that the practice of technology diplomacy is maturing. At the moment, you have about 63 institutions that are linked to a government, be it, innovation outpost, consulate or honorary consuls, working on behalf of diplomacy, if you want, in the Bay Area, out of which about a third have a formal diplomacy that relates to a technology workstream. What's interesting is to realize that at the moment, only 4 to 5 countries have a tech ambassador in Silicon Valley. Many of them have an ambassador that is based elsewhere, mostly at their HQ. The US just named one a few months ago. You may have seen that the first country that named a technology ambassador was Denmark in Silicon Valley in 2017. Well, guess what? They just relocated that role back to HQ about 3 months ago. So we are witnessing a field that is constantly being shaped. But still, there is a maturity in the dialogue that you have. And more interestingly enough, we can witness flavors of multilateralism, because it's not just about nation states engaging with the global technology firms. It is also international organizations, the ICRC, OHCHR, ITU, and so on, regularly engage at a substantial level in the Bay Area. So the dialogue is there. The other level to consider as well is that it is becoming extremely geopolitical. A lot has happened over the past few years, from the politicization of the exchange on the technology. Look at the questions of 5G and Huawei, TikTok, the questions about the conflict in Ukraine, how many private companies have stepped in to migrate the data from physical infrastructure into the cloud. You also see a lot that has happened with the COVID. You know, Microsoft said that they witnessed 2 years of digital transformation in 2 months. So a lot of the dialogues and negotiations, if you want, are now happening on Zoom or on Teams, which is one facet of technology diplomacy. Yet at the same time, you see the dialogue that's emerging there, very much focusing some key thematic issues. Let's go back at it. You know, first level, the practice is maturing. Second level, we discussed about how it's very much about a thematic issue, you know, or how it is being shaped by geopolitics. And the third level was about the fact that it focuses on key thematic issues, namely human rights is becoming a bigger team that brings this ecosystem together, for instance, through the Silicon Valley chapter of the Freedom Online Coalition. But it is also, there is a lot going on about the fight against authoritarian regimes, which brings back the questions about the hegemony of those discussions and which is the bridge to maybe my fourth and last contextual observation. There is a lack of diversity that is clearly there. If you look at the 63 nations who is active, you have no African voices. You have only 13 countries from Asia, which is a lot. But when you know that you may have, you know, an embassy or a consulate of 2 or 3 staff members having to cover 500,000 of citizens, you know, in some of the states that are part of the jurisdiction, it leaves so much bandwidth to really have a proactive dialogue with some of the bigger technology firms. So that's a bit of the environment in which technology diplomacy is being done. There is a lot that we can probably discuss about it. Overall, yes, there are flavors of multilateralism that are emerging there. There is a lot of promises. We can see a lot of outcomes, and I'll discuss them more maybe in the discussions. But if we focus now on the role of the diplomat, if we look at the first thing that is quite obvious, is the skill set of a diplomat. Regularly, we hear a frustration within the diplomatic corps over there about how unequipped they are to discuss the technicity that many of those discussions have. You know, if you talk about, you know, the cloud, if you talk about just the way the internet functions, most of the diplomats do have a very basic understanding of things. And very often the people who have the expertise are not in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. They are in the Ministry of the Interior. They are with those who relate to technologies altogether within their own administration. And that can easily create a gap, not only within the administration itself, but also as you are trying to have a dialogue with the private sector. They know that you don't necessarily have all of the equipment, so it can also create a chance for them to try to push their agenda or to try to take advantage of the lack of competencies that you have. So that's clearly a gap. You know, how do you increase the skill set of not only the tech ambassadors, but anybody who are there who are trying to bridge this gap between technology and humanity? Another key observation there is that as part of the toolkit of a diplomat there, it's not just about reporting. We have this course on AI, and a lot of what a diplomat do is to report. If AI can help you reporting easier, you may save 50% of your time, therefore being able to do other things, which is great. But at the same time, I think the main point here is that if you want to be a successful diplomat in the Bay Area, you need to learn how to anticipate things. And it's not just about discussing the current technology, it is about thinking 2, 3, 4 generations of technologies ahead of time, which goes back to the notion of key gaps that become problematic when you are trying to bridge the gap between democracy and technology. Which brings me to my second point, networks. So we talked about the skill sets. If we now look at the networks that a diplomat needs, it's not just about being able to engage effectively with some of the big tech firms or whoever can see where technology is heading. It's first and foremost about navigating the complexities of your own internal administration. And it's true that very often it's easy to be at a conference where you meet many relevant people, but to be able to translate the type of things that you want to see in the ecosystem takes a lot of agility to report them back at your HQ and to talk to the right person and to try to bring change altogether. Also, I've had one very interesting experience where one part of the Swiss administration reached out to me because of something that has happened on a social media channel. So I took my phone and I called the technology company, asking who can I talk to on that very issue. I had a good network within the company, and they sent me back to someone in Dublin because Switzerland is being covered by the EMEA team of that company. So it's not just about building a network in the Bay Area. You need to understand the own complexity of your own administration, but then knowing how to engage with the right people. In a Dublin, in that case, it can be New York, it can be Washington, here DC. Also, many of the public affairs who will be able to speak your language as a government are not based in the Bay Area, they are based in Washington. So it's not just a matter of being efficient in the Bay Area, it's about how can you as a diplomat understand, the agility of networking to being able to build the relevant network so that you can activate it whenever there is an issue and you have to call someone. When it comes to network, the last point I wanted to make is that very often the key challenge is that the company in front of you is bombarded with all of the other countries who are asking the same thing from themselves. If we look at AI, the summit that the UK has launched a few weeks ago, I know of about 5 to 6 countries who are hoping to do the same. So imagine you work on AI at, say, Microsoft, you have about 7, 8, 9, 10 countries, maybe every month that are coming to you asking to engage on a strategic level. How do you create the relevant bandwidth within your own company so that you can really address substantial issues is a key challenge, especially when the people you recruit very often within those companies are coming from government, so they will tell you as a government what you want to hear. So it brings back the question, how do you bring substantial change? And my last point is about the mindset. And I talked about the agility, and I think that's something that diplomats very often are not necessarily used to doing, especially when on the other side you have people who are so embedded into a specific ideology in the Bay Area. The Bay Area mindset, some will call it the California ideology, is very much about bottom-up engagement. So it's not because you come with your president or your head of state that they will actually make space for you. So it's very much a matter of understanding what's the right level of engagement to have so you can really much change systems. And there, one key observation I made personally is that it is very easy to talk to the public affairs team. It's very easy to talk to people who are from your tribe, the diplomatic tribe. But if you want to achieve change, you need to be able to talk to the software developers and the CEOs, because in those companies, those who have the ability to shift systems are at the top, or they work in software developments. And it's very hard to accept them. And as we know in diplomacy, it relies on our ability to create hallways where informal exchange can happen. And if I look at the system, that's probably what's needed the most. How do you create that safe space where you can actually have a substantial exchange with those who have the ability to shift systems in the Bay Area? So mindset, skill sets, and networks, and I'm pretty sure that there is a lot that we can say on this, all together. The story keeps repeating itself at the end of the day.
Thank you, Yannick. Thank you very much. When I hear, so 3 of you, to me, it seems that both trainings and networks are sources of power, empowerment or disempowerment, but also they're, in a way, political. They're sites of political distribution. Who has access to the training, who doesn't, who can afford having a representation in the Bay Area and build some networks and have a conversation with the right skills and so on. Maybe do you want to elaborate a little bit from your perspectives, what you experienced in this different time?
Yes, thank you. I suppose we are looking at a time when the comparative resources of the global north and global south were thrown into stark relief. And we see that inequality, global inequality, although in the 1960s, early 1960s, there was a lot of hope that the gap would close, we have not seen as much of a closing of that gap, in fact, a widening of that gap in many respects. And as Yannick kind of highlighted, no African voices in the discussions about what to do about AI in terms of international collaboration, as an example. And so a lot of the discussions taking place in the training programs that we studied and that took place partly here, partly through UNITAR, partly through other programs, were very concerned with and aimed at reducing inequality and closing the gap. And some of the technical skills that trainees were taught did have kind of very close relationships to technological abilities or technical abilities. At the end of the 1950s, early 1960s, this was to do with learning ciphers and how to use those, how to use telegrams, and to write very concisely for these kinds of forms of communication. But there's also a lot of discussion about international economics and what should be taught in terms of economic knowledge. What economic knowledge does a diplomat need to have, particularly coming from a developing country, to be able to represent their state and network effectively with economic actors in the international sphere in order to negotiate trade agreements, in order to renegotiate the global economic system, and the ambition was that great, particularly in the case of UNITAR. And the United Nations Institute for Training and Research had a really important mandate around the new international economic order, which was kind of handed down through the United Nations. And this was really integrated into the training of diplomats. Now, how that was integrated into the training of diplomats is something that we're particularly interested in. And actually, we're quite critical of how it was attempted, okay? By rendering the knowledge the diplomat needs as being very technical, it actually limits the political empowerment of the diplomatic person. They're turned into something more of a technician rather than a creator or a politician. I've got a quote in front of me actually from the at the time the director of the Institut Africain de Genève, which, if you know your history of this institution, is one of the precursors to the Graduate Institute that was focused on development. And he was writing to the executive director of UNITAR in 1965, and he said, "It seems to me that many international organizations have succumbed to the temptation to train their collaborators in technical knowledge on precise tasks and making them executors, not creators." Mm-hmm. So he recommended that an academic specialism like economics or sociology was required, and that the academic institution like the Graduate Institute, like the University of Oxford, like the Columbia University, was a really important element in the training of diplomats. So I'm not sure how much that responds to your question, but I think there's always a political question to be asked in terms of technique, technology, and knowledge.
Do you want to react to this, Yannick?
Yeah, one thing that has been striking to me when you talk to many of the diplomats, in a sense, one of the things that has been striking when you talk to many of the diplomats there is that they embrace somehow the fake it until you make it when it comes to the technology education they have. And a lot of it actually comes from a self-guided courses that they might have on Coursera. There is a lot of great programs out there. The question will be, there is only so much you can achieve when you face experts, that have done their PhD in a computational science and so on. So I think that's really much where the game is going to be played in the future. What institution are we going to create, or what program are we going to make available to train not only the established consulate, but also all of those emerging voices that need to have a seat at the table. And we need to learn from history, so we should not recreate a top-down process like back in the days. It needs to be agile, it needs to be available, and new technologies can really do a lot, in making it available. But it takes strategy. And one just best practices that I found was quite interesting, the new American ambassador for cyber issues at large made it mandatory, or just created a curriculum that is mandatory for any diplomats to follow on the baseline of what digital technologies are. So I think it goes back to how can you maybe support governments to define what are the priorities for themselves, and how do they internalize it as part of their educational programs that they offer to their own diplomat and so on. Also, another observation, and it's probably one thing that may stretch the system a bit, but if you look at the background profiles of the UK tech ambassador in the Bay Area, who was just named the envoy to the United States on the technology, so having a broader remit. If you look at his profile, if you look at the profile of the tech ambassador of Canada, the tech ambassador of Denmark, they are not coming from the administration. They are all external hires who come with the technical knowledge already, or the ability to work across sectors. So you really have to look at those two things, educational strategy, how do you equip the South and so on their own priorities. But then also, how can you be smart in who you hire? If I look at African Voices, there are many great investors or VCs or people who understand how technology works. Should one of them, even if it's pro bono, play the role of a tech ambassador for its own country, and so on. There is a lot of different scenarios that you can come up with. So yeah, that will be my feedback.
Thank you. Ruth, do you wanna add to this?
I think the only thing I'd add is that I think we can see the kind of new tech and AI, we see it as this kind of huge change, but that actually the kind of issues that the UK and all countries now are facing in terms of the power of Silicon Valley, the power of those companies, is actually something which diplomats from the Global South have been dealing with and very aware of since they came, became independent states in the 50s. Kwame Nkrumah was talking about the way that he had, you have political independence, but you don't have economic independence because of the very much those kind of 19th century earlier kind of colonial companies that were working within those. So it may be something that seems very new to us, to people and diplomats representing the US and potentially European countries. But actually these kind of challenges about how you relate to a company that isn't headquartered in your jurisdiction.
Absolutely.
It has a much bigger budget than your country. It has much more power, much more communicative power, much more, in all ways is very powerful. How do you engage with those? Those are debates that were happening in the training programs that were happening here and in Cameroon and in Kenya in the 60s and 70s. And so I suppose these are now debates which are happening, which seem to be relevant to a far broader set of people, but maybe we could think about how they were addressed, sometimes successfully, sometimes not in the past, and those connections too.
Thank you, Ruth. Maybe I have a follow-up question, but I would like maybe to turn to you. Do you have any question for our speakers? Yes, please, sir.
It's the most interesting for me, as I was involved probably in most aspects of what you're working on, and directly in charge of Eric, in charge of Nairobi, spent 2 years in Trinidad, and then I directed an institute which focused on the training diplomats, and I'm not going to go into that because it's a fascinating story. I'm glad you look at that. I will go to the challenge we're facing. Some of you may have attended the JESTA summit. And you know what JESTA is all about. It's the Geneva Science and Diplomacy Anticipator. A remarkable institution just in its infancy, but an important one. I think for the ones who attended the summit, one thing was clear, is that science and technology are on a solid path. Diplomacy is not. And I would say one thing is that you cannot deal and work on diplomacy without working on governance. And we know very well that diplomacy is in a crisis. and governance is in a much bigger crisis. And one of the challenges we're facing is really to reinvent diplomacy and to reinvent governance. And we're going to have to do that very fast. You might have seen the remark which President Biden made November 1st. We are going to have, within the next 2-3 years, to take the decision which will shape the planet. I think he spoke about 6, 7, 8 generation. No, not generation, decades. So it's a huge challenge. And I think the first question we have to ask ourselves is that, do we need diplomats anymore? And if we need diplomats, what kind of diplomats do we need? You rightly said something, which means when you have a negotiation, a technical negotiation, it's not the diplomat. The diplomat is useless most of the time. I have organized many simulations where you see very clearly the people coming from diplomacy were useless. The people knowing the technicalities knew what they were doing. If you look at the institutions such as ITU or WIPO, which are institutions of the 19th century, the key people who set up the institution were technical people. You had one diplomat from the Swiss Department of Foreign Affairs, and you had the people coming from the ministry in charge and knowing the thing. So we have to rethink, reinvent, and that will have an impact on the training, on the education. And I think we are to, and we should never forget that we cannot deal with diplomacy alone. We have to deal it with governance, because the diplomat is a tool of governance, is one of the instruments which steers. So I've been long, but it's fascinating work, and probably one of the most important tasks we have the next 2 or 3 years in front of us. We don't have much more time.
Thank you. Thank you. Would you like to react to this first?
Just really to say it's absolutely fascinating to hear that reflection, particularly on the uselessness of the diplomats within that space, and also that that's not a sudden new thing, that there's histories of that too. So thank you, and thank you for contributing to our wider project as well.
May I just want to say one thing? We have to ask ourselves: is it the diplomat which we have to rethink? First, no, I believe it's the ministries of foreign affairs which we have to reinvent. And when I was discussing with the dean of Fletcher School last year, and we were in agreement, the Quai d'Orsay, Foreign Office, and Department of State is going down the drain. And the ministers of foreign affairs in those countries, there's a new one in England from today on, is Cameron.
I need to have a look.
Yeah, Cameron is the new foreign minister.
Sir, do you have a question? Because we
no,
have other
but
questions.
the question is, how do you see the relation, the impact, the relation between governance and diplomacy?
And also maybe to add on to what you just said before, maybe if you have some suggestions of ideas of how we could reshape or redefine the role of the diplomat. No, it's a bit what you mentioned as well. So based on your experience, your view from the past, what your experience as well.
I think from our project, you're putting your finger on a recurring question. Do we still need diplomats, or what should a diplomat be or do or know? And what we've seen in our research, which spans several decades, is that by the time the required knowledge, inverted commas, has been identified, codified, made into a pedagogical material or course, and delivered to the diplomats, it is already old news and it is already obsolete. And those in power have already moved on to the next stage. And so those who are entering into the system. In our case, the newly independent states, formerly colonized states, are disadvantaged in the new world, and so we're really interested in ways that that disadvantage was contested and overturned and resisted through training programs. It's not as simple as black and white winners and losers, but that's the question is constantly asked, and it's interesting what answers came at different times, and B, that there is always a political set of relations that are reproduced through training. So thank you for your comment. I couldn't speak to the more specific question about the relationship of diplomacy and governance, but perhaps you could, Yannick.
Yeah, I'll maybe go back to one point that I was making before. Everything rise and fall on strategy. And if you work in a company and you need to define a strategy for your company, you don't start to think of the skills that you have. You look into what's your vision of the future. And I think one opportunity for many of those countries to be more efficient is on foreign policy strategy. What are they trying to accomplish? What's the vision of the system, and how do they flesh out in the 4 to 5 year plan that they have to renew every 4 to 5 years in front of the parliament? And I guess being clear that that's the main tool for change, in my view, for now, and encouraging our leaders, to be visionary, to really look at the future with high ambition, and to then think of what skill set do they need within their administration to get there. That's probably one way to improve the current situation from what it is. It's very much a matter of having the strategic thinkers to look into the future and having their organization following. That would be just 1 cent over there.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Thank you so much. It doesn't even work, or? Does it work? Yeah. Excellent. I'm with UNITA, so thank you so much for mentioning us, and of course also to the two here. I just wanted to mention they helped us actually quite a lot because we were celebrating our 60th anniversary this year, and Jonathan and Ruth helped us to dig into our history a little bit. I want to come to that one point, Jonathan, you're making about this power struggle in the 70s, 80s that you discovered, and we reflect a little bit on the new international economic order, and then make the link to today. And this comes also a little bit this question about power relations right now when we look at diplomacy in today's world as a reflection of where the world stands and wants to go. There seems to be this huge shift right now. And at governance level, of course, we have a paralysis almost at many of the levels. And I wanted to ask you, can we use that example that you digged into from so long ago, which almost sank the institute I'm working for, because we kind of put ourselves to that side, the NIEO, and we're almost sunk with that because some other governments said, don't go that way. But maybe, can you tell us a little bit about that power dynamics from the past, and maybe how we can learn about this today, how an institute of training, or maybe diplomacy itself, can help understand and maybe overcome some of those power challenges we are seeing right now. I mean, just as an example, some quote-unquote Western countries nowadays say it's the rules-based international order we want to see prevail, while others say it's a new type of order we want to see. This is the struggle we are seeing, not only on technology, on real world power issues. So how can we learn from this past example that you were looking at, maybe to learn something from to today? Or maybe just as an historical example, where do you put your emphasis on, and can it have a positive, a negative, or maybe a very mixed result in the end? Long question to you.
So for those who don't know about the new international economic order, it was an idea that kind of came up in the early 1960s and kind of became kind of official policy almost in the early 1970s, and was the idea really that there could be a kind of what Adam Getachew, the political scientist, talks about as a kind of welfare world, so that there could be a kind of redistribution of economic power. We didn't need to just accept this. It seems hard to imagine from today's perspective where the neoliberal vision, it seems so embedded, but this idea that actually there were colonial legacies that had embedded inequalities, and that there could be, just as there was at national level, a kind of redistributive state, that there could also be that at an international level, and that the UN could in some ways play a role within that. It was an idea that had a lot of power, actually, and was led by people like Julius Nyerere from Tanzania and Michael Manley from Jamaica. It founded on the rocks of differences between global South countries, oil crises, and the rise of structural adjustment as something which was only things that meant that global South countries had to change their economics and their governments, not global North countries. There's something I learned recently, was that structural adjustment started as an idea that structures across the world should change, so both in the North and the South. So for me, I think the role that diplomats were playing then was very much in pushing that and trying to use those international institutions to work for those ideas. For me, for now, what I find exciting about those kinds of ideas are this vision of what Getachew calls this kind of anti-colonial world making, so an alternative vision for what the future could be like. And I feel like at the moment, we're missing that. But sometimes at moments of crises, creative as well as dangerous opportunities kind of appear. And so maybe this is a moment where something more positive could emerge. It doesn't feel very positive at the moment.
Mm-hmm. And if I can add to that, I think specifically in terms of training and how diplomats work and could be trained today, we've talked and mentioned multilateralism several times, and a crisis of governance. There's certainly a crisis of multilateralism as well. What was really radical about not just the training programs of UNITAR, but of several others, and all of the training programs that we're working on, is that they were multilateral. They were taking trainees from a range of different states, and they were being trained together. And the power of those training relationships is something that we're trying to understand more. But certainly is something that allows for different, as you've put it, flavors of multilateralism to emerge. And I think it's striking that most of these programs that we've studied located in the global North did not train the diplomats of the states that they were located in. So the Foreign Office in the United Kingdom only started a diplomatic academy a matter of years ago. There has historically been no training for, it's all been on the job for British diplomats. However, of course, our Oxford University dons were the right people to train the diplomats of other states. The same for the Graduate Institute. The trainees were coming from the world over, but not from Switzerland. The same for the Paris school, the Institut des Études d'Outre-mer at the time. So I just wanted to underline the radical nature of that multilateralism. I don't think the benefits of that have been really fully appreciated or understood. But I think that's somewhere that we need to look again in the present moment.
Yeah, but there is a question. I don't know if it's...
We have two
I'm
questions.
happy to take a few more questions.
Thank you very much to the panel. My name is Veronica and I come from Kenya. I think you mentioned Kenya a couple of times. So I think I have two questions, quick ones. And I think the first one is to Dr. Jonathan. I think you mentioned the question of technician and versus creator. And I was just trying to think, is this by design or is it a broader political question? If you would please shed some more light on that. And then I think on Yannick, when we come to, I like to think about diplomats or any other professional for that matter as a product of a system, right? And they just don't happen. We just don't get to a tech ambassador. There is a system that nurtures or cultivates one to become whatever they become, either success or failure or whatever. So in this regard, when you're looking at broader questions on innovation, not just on technology, but broader innovation within countries, within societies, do you think, or rather, if you would a little bit share more light on what educational structures foster more innovation, and why you see, for instance, one society tending to be more innovative than another one on a technological basis, but also innovation in the broader space? Thank you.
You want to go first?
Yeah, should we answer the question or take one?
Yeah, one by one.
Yeah, great question. I think it comes down to this recurring question: what is education for? What do educators think they're doing when they stand before a class or take a class on? And what kinds of knowledges, skills, values are they trying to inculcate in their trainees? And it's always a political question, always. Even more so when you're training diplomats. And we've written a paper that's hopefully going to make its way into the world in a few months' time, where we unpack the power relations of the classroom and the power relations of the international space, and through the lens of tutelage. This idea that there's a relationship of tutor and tutee, and there's also a relationship of colonizer and colonized, and there is always a kind of a power relation at play. More specifically then, that power relation can manifest itself through a desire to inculcate certain skills, which often get boiled down to passing a test, which is the more sort of technical skills kind of critique, which was being leveled in 1965. Where you can say, well, tick, they've passed, they've understood, they're now prepared and ready to be diplomats, or there is more of a character focused soft skills. Is this person prepared to enter a room and to negotiate on behalf of their country? That's much more difficult to test for, and so there are different pedagogical strategies and different traditions and cultures that feed into that educational encounter, but it's always present and it's always something to unpack. I don't know if that's specifically responded to your question, but I'm happy to talk more afterwards.
And on my side, maybe to your point about innovation, one question that, one story that I faced when I was with the International Committee of the Red Cross, we were supposed to enhance innovation across the organization. And it turned out that we had a lot of resistance from the heads of delegations and the people working in the field. They were like, we are in the midst of emergencies, why are you asking us to innovate? Which is a very fair question. And one of the things that we realized after a lot of back and forth is that we could either try to push to ask them to do something that they are not doing yet, or to look at what they are currently doing and to reframe it as innovation. And it turned out that they were innovating on a daily basis. They were just not calling it innovation. If you look at the way the SRC was dealing with responding immediately to a changing environment, negotiating with people, using innovative approaches and so on, innovation was something they were doing on a daily basis. So to convince them to innovate, you had to be like, you are already innovating. We want to support the existing, not creating something new. And innovation very often is mistakenly thought as creating something new. Very often it's just about mixing ingredients differently so that it tastes different. And I feel like when we plan strategically about how to enhance, an innovative culture that either embraces innovation or digital transformation, it's very often as simple as finding a few ingredients and calling them differently. It doesn't have to be about changing the whole system, but finding one or two simple intervention points that would help you innovate better. And delivering the outcomes, and that's probably the most important point, delivering the outcomes that your stakeholders expect from you. So that's one small insight that I hope will respond to your question. Yeah.
Thank you, Yannick. We have, I think, one more. Okay, we take maybe there's two more questions and then we close.
Thank you very much. Actually, I have two questions, if I may. One to Mr. Heiniger. You mentioned several times the lack of knowledge or the not deep enough knowledge of diplomats in tech. Where do you see the distinction between the necessary knowledge of the diplomat and that of the regulator? Because I think we have two different expressions for two different positions. And I'm not sure that the diplomat should be the regulator, and I'm not sure the regulator should be the diplomat. So what is your point of view on that by experience? And the second question is to Dr. Craggs and Harris. And I'm not sure the parallel is perfect, but now with tech companies, we are talking about non-state actors. In the period you make your research on, the non-state actor that comes to my mind with a big power is, of course, oil companies and energy companies. Did you face in your research any reference to training diplomats to deal with those companies? And if yes, could you advise how it can be transposed to high-tech companies now? Thank you.
Maybe we can take the other question in the back at the same time.
Yes, thank you. So I'm working in global health, and what we've seen is that emerging a new cohort of diplomats coming usually from South, from global South, and it's about diplomats coming from civil society and from communities. And I found this discussion is very interesting, but like to see if you see opportunities for this new cohort of diplomats that are coming from civil society into this global North diplomacy. Thank you.
Just quickly on the training for connecting with businesses. I mean, definitely it was part of the training courses. Was kind of particularly. I think it was as much opportunities for the businesses to make the connections with the diplomats who were going to be important and the governments that were going to be important in these new markets or markets where they already had connections but were concerned about potentially changing political context that might influence their funding. But for example, the Graduate Institute trainees are going out, they're meeting Nestle, they're meeting all the big companies, and there's a lot of that kind of informal connections. I'm not sure about kind of more, and then there's also a lot about kind of negotiating economic agreements and negotiating with businesses, but I don't think there's so much in terms of how to, I don't know if there's more you want to say, Jonathan, on that one.
No, I think I'd underline it was very much more an opportunistic approach from industries in the global north. So in Switzerland, for example, the trainees were taken to visit the factories of Sandoz and of Nestle as partly as a kind of touristic experience, but also to meet the directors and to make those kinds of connections. The ANC, when they were being trained towards the end of the apartheid regime in South Africa, they were in London and they were dispatched for the afternoon to go to the HQ of British Petroleum, of various other large companies, as a kind of practice of engaging with companies, and they kind of came back and reflected on their experiences and so on. But the encounters also actually happened. They were sort of practices, but they also happened. So I don't know how much that is relevant to today, but...
Well, it's funny because there is something called the technology safaris that very often we see in the Bay Area, where you have a delegation of diplomats or high-level officials going through, Meta, Twitter, and so on, and they all see the same type of things. It's a safari, but it's maybe back to your point. The work of a diplomat at the end of the day, from the experience I've made, is very much about bridge building and connecting the dots. Regulation is not so much there. However, the environment is shifting. And I just wanted to add one very interesting experience I've had. When I work with Swissnex, we've been in the Bay Area working for the Ministry of Education, not the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, for almost 20 years. Working informally, saying it's bottom-up innovation. We're here to represent the interests of higher education actors, the private sector and so on. We are not the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Over the past few months, we've seen a trend with the EU opening an office in the Bay Area. The EU sent a high-level Diplomat to speak on behalf of the EU and all of its member states on regulation with the DSA here coming up and the AI Act, and speaking on behalf of everybody on regulation. And what I have witnessed is that it is harder and harder for countries to pretend that they are not working for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or that they are not doing regulations, because on the other side, they expect you to listen to them to then regulate you. And it goes back to the question of how can you convince them that you are really there to connect the dots and build bridges. And at the end of the day, I think we need to think in terms of what can we do when it comes to institutional agility to create those safe spaces that can truly lead to collaboration. Otherwise, you will be part of this block building exercise that we are witnessing that does not generate the right outcomes. So the jury is still out there as far as how we will make it happen, but that's clearly one challenge.
Thank you very much. Thank you all, and have a nice afternoon. We'll send you the recording of this session in a couple of days. Thank you very much for your participation. Thank you.